So Wes Huff blows up with his interview on Joe Rogan, and YouTube's favorite atheist, Alex O'Connor, got a hold of it. So
of course, I had to make a response.
O'Connor's point is largely focused on the resurrection appearances of Jesus. Christians, myself included, like to make the point that there were tons of eyewitnesses to the resurrection. O'Connor argues in favor of the idea that these early Christians were hallucinating the resurrected Christ.
Remember, sometimes groups do claim to see visions, such as various apparitions of Mary.
In other words, if Christians want to argue that the resurrection was real because there were groups of eyewitnesses seeing Jesus, then these Christians would have to also admit that Marian apparitions are real.
Does Wes Huff believe in this Catholic miracle? Do you? And if not, why not?
This is actually a great question that I don't think gets dealt with very much at all. Now, I don't want to make an anti-Catholic video here. I want to respond to O'Connor's argument to show that the resurrection appearances actually are good evidence for the resurrection. However, in order to do that, I need to show the drastic difference between the evidence for Marian apparitions and the resurrection appearances. Truthfully, I always thought Marian apparitions were an impressive point. In the back of my mind, I really thought, if I look into these things closely, I'm probably going to have to change my mind about a few things. I honestly thought to myself, there's got to be something here that will make me uncomfortable, and I'll be forced to genuinely consider it. I finally looked into it a few months ago, and it was not even close to as impressive as I thought it would be. Marian apparitions, when you look past the rhetoric and look at the actual data, they are just so severely unimpressive that it becomes a bit embarrassing. I honestly, genuinely thought there was going to be something to it, and there is not. I originally looked into this topic for my Ultimate Questions podcast, where I've done some episodes responding to the hallucination counter against the resurrection. I wanted to look at claimed cases of group hallucinations, and I knew that atheists sometimes use Marian apparitions as an example of this. So when I saw O'Connor saying that there needs to be a response to this, I thought to myself, hey, I've already done that. O'Connor's argument would seem to be that whatever reason a Protestant gives for not accepting Marian apparitions, he can turn around and give that same reason for why he doesn't accept the resurrection appearances. The big point I want to make is that Marian apparitions are not at all as well evidenced as the appearances of Jesus. The reason for the confusion here is that people don't bother going into the details in the evidence. So people like O'Connor just do a quick look on the Wikipedia page and don't really appreciate just how bad these Marian apparitions are in terms of the actual experience of what was happening. So the goal today is to do a deep dive into the actual evidence of what occurred during Marian apparitions so that we can compare it to the evidence for the resurrection appearances. And spoiler alert, I think the resurrection appearances are superior by a lot. O'Connor made his point pretty quickly, almost in passing, but others have jumped on it, quite notably Cameron Bertuzzi of Capturing Christianity. The crazy part is, he's a Roman Catholic, and he ended up releasing several videos essentially strengthening O'Connor's argument against the resurrection for him, because Bertuzzi thinks that Marian apparitions are fantastic. He made a few videos about the Marian apparitions at Zaytun, and I'll be responding to those in my next video coming out soon. There are also other Marian apparitions that are worth looking at in order to see the drastic difference in terms of the quality of evidence compared to the resurrection appearances. So I'll be going into the other Marian apparitions in a video I'll release in a few weeks. So hit the subscribe button so you can get updated about those upcoming videos. But for now, I want to concentrate on the main example that Alex O'Connor used, the Marian apparition, Our Lady of Fatima.
A large crowd witnessing a prophesied miracle, and we actually know who saw it and precisely what they saw. We even have their direct testimony.
This example is both an apparition of Mary and an event called the Miracle of the Sun, which happened in Fatima, Portugal back in 1917. This is often treated as the best example of a Marian apparition ever, because the Miracle of the Sun was seen by tens of thousands of people. But again, the important thing is to look at the actual data involved. For starters, the Miracle of the Sun, witnessed by tens of thousands of people, isn't how the story begins. It begins with 3 children seeing an apparition of the Virgin Mary. These kids were 10, 9, and 7 years old. The apparition said very typical things for a Marian apparition, like asking for prayer and repentance, but it also asked for devotion to her Immaculate Heart. And of course, she asked for a chapel to be built in her honor, which is also extremely common in these apparitions. As far as the actual apparition goes, it is, once again, unimpressive, because it was only seen by a very small group of children. However, the apparition appeared for several months, always on the 13th of the month. People started to pay attention to the little girls, and for the month of August, a local administrator, Arthur de Oliveira Santos, who didn't believe in the apparition and wanted to stop all this nonsense, locked the children up so they couldn't be at the apparition location. By this point, it had gained popularity, so people showed up for the apparition, but the girls didn't show up because they were locked up, and the apparition never appeared. Now, the August date is a little confusing, but basically, the kids were locked up for a few days to prevent the apparition on the 13th, but once they were released, they apparently saw another apparition on the wrong day and in the wrong location. The following month, in September, the girls were released and went to the site of the apparitions. Because of the persecution of the girls by the guy locking them up, they gained an even greater following. On September 13th, tens of thousands of people came. Now notice, this is still a month before the miracle of the sun. So, on September 13th, the girls saw the apparition, but no one else did. That's important. Notice, the girls saw it, but no one else in the tens of thousands of people saw it. Also, those present described the girls as being in an ecstatic sort of state, like a trance. Some people who were present said they saw something like a ball of light moving around, but again, no one saw the apparition. I would argue this could easily be a misapprehension of sensory data, where they are just seeing something normal, but their brains are ascribing additional data to it, because they're expecting and assuming there's an apparition present. The thing that people focus on is the fact that the apparition told the girls there would be a miracle in the following month of October, which people assumed would be on the 13th, which is when the miracle of the sun occurred. However, the apparition also said that in October, our Lord will come, as well as Our Lady of Sorrows and Our Lady of Carmel. Saint Joseph will appear with the child Jesus to bless the world. The apparition also said to the girls, God is pleased with your sacrifices. He does not want you to sleep with the robe on, but only to wear it during the daytime. You might be thinking, what's this rope thing about? This is because they had previously been told by the apparition to wear a type of rope as a form of self-harm, as a type of penance for their sins. This was very uncomfortable, which led them to having difficulty sleeping. So the apparition was telling them they didn't have to wear it at nighttime anymore. When the apparition then gave the prediction that a miracle would happen in the following month of October, that's literally all the prediction was. In October, I will perform a miracle, so that all may believe. There's a bunch of important things to point out here. These are literally children. So this could have all started with them just playing pretend, and when they started getting attention, they kept it going. They were also in an ecstatic state, which seems like a dissociation occurring for the girls. Along with the predisposition and expectation, this could very easily be an hallucinatory experience for them. There were tons of other people present, and no one else saw the apparition, which would also make the situation seem like a pretty straightforward case of hallucinations. Another very important thing to notice is the prediction that Jesus would return in October, along with some saints. This is important because it doesn't seem like anything like this occurred. The children later said that they saw these figures in October on the day of the miracle of the sun, but again, no one else did. It seems strange to give a prediction like this and have basically nothing come of it, except that the kids see it. Like, Jesus is gonna return? Is this the second coming? Or something else where it's like Jesus is 1.5 time coming? And so Jesus actually returns, but doesn't actually do anything? There's a prophecy that Jesus is returning, and he supposedly did, but just to appear to 3 little kids with literally no other effect whatsoever. So it would seem to be a false prophecy, which scripture treats quite severely. It's also important to note that, for the sake of the crowd, nothing happened. They watched the kids see something, apparently, but there was nothing for them to see. And yet, the crowd was still overcome with excitement, enough that the next time even more people showed up. So, October 13th comes around. Between 70 and 100,000 people show up at the site of the past apparitions. It had been raining, and when the clouds parted, revealing the sun, the people witnessed a strange phenomenon for about 10 minutes. Some people said it looked like the sun was crashing down to the earth. Others said it looked like the sun moved around in the sky. Other people were screaming and crying. Some people were even confessing their sins, thinking that judgment was coming. One said that the sun looked like it was surrounded with scarlet flame one moment and aureoled in yellow and deep purple in the next moment. Another said it was like a fire wheel. Still another said the sun seemed to come down in a zigzag, menacing the earth. Terrified, I ran and hid myself among the people, who were weeping and expecting the end of the world at any moment. Then the sun went back to normal. Are there any explanations for this? Actually, yes, there is. There are atmospheric phenomena called sundogs and parhelic circles. This looks like a giant ring of sunlight in the sky. It can also look like 3 suns attached to the main sun, one being on the left, another right, and one above. In some cases, the sun pillars look like the sun crashing down to the earth, like some witnesses said. Another interesting thing to note is that these sorts of astrological events often occur when it's cold, when there has been water in the air. And guess what? It was October when it's cold, and it had just finished raining, so there was water in the air. Now, I admit that if I had a high degree of religious expectation, and I was told a miracle was going to happen that day, and all of a sudden everyone is yelling and screaming and offering up confessions while pointing at the sky, and I turn around and I see this, I'd probably freak out. If I didn't know about sundogs and parhelic circles, and I came a long way to see a miracle, and people all around me are in absolute mass hysteria saying it's a miracle, I think I would feel perfectly justified in thinking it was miraculous. And yes, I would probably even scream along with everyone else. Sometimes people will point out that not everyone present was a believer. They say that this eliminates the idea that there would be a religious expectation because if they weren't a believer, then they wouldn't be expecting a miracle. However, this is a major element that I think has a great deal of misunderstanding surrounding it. The people who were showing up on October 13th were doing so because they were expecting something to happen. Additionally, this was a trek. The miracle of the sun happened in a remote location out in the middle of nowhere. It would have been a pretty large investment to go out there by the predicted date of October 13th. These people were traveling for hours along dirt roads, possibly by horse-drawn cart, but mostly walking. If you're planning this trip out there because you've been told a miracle was going to happen on that date, you better believe you're expecting to see something, even if you're not a Roman Catholic yourself. Also, while it's happening, there are tens of thousands of people screaming and crying and confessing. This just sounds like a case of mass hysteria. Absolutely, you are going to get swept up in the mob mentality. Again, even if you're not a believer. It's also important to point out, this wasn't an hallucination. You're not going to get 70,000 people's brains all inventing the same situation out of nothing. However, this could very easily be a case of misapprehension of sensory data. We'll go more into this point in my next video, but for now, you'll notice nothing actually happened aside from the astrological phenomena. There was no apparition of Mary to the crowds and no message to be heard. The crowds of people didn't witness anything of any religious significance at all. It had been raining, and now the sun comes out and people see an astrological phenomenon. Because of the mass hysteria and incredible power of suggestion involved, people start to apply meaning to the sun's strange behavior. The only really impressive thing about this event is that the previous month the girls had said the apparition told them it would happen. However, the actual prediction was incredibly vague. It's just about as vague as humanly possible, because all they were told was, a miracle is going to happen. There were no specifics given whatsoever. The people were absolutely primed for a situation where literally anything could have happened, and they would have said it was a miracle. That said, there was some kind of astrological phenomenon. So is this an accurate prediction? Kind of, but at the same time, there are many people who make these kinds of predictions. This includes people who claim to have seen the Virgin Mary, and there's a prediction involved. At some point, someone is going to make a vague prediction, and if anything even vaguely interesting happens, they'll say it's a confirmation of the prediction. If this sounds a little overly skeptical, think about it this way. Suppose every day I make a prediction, something interesting will happen tomorrow. And then the moment that something interesting does happen, I say to you, see, I told you so. But that's so vague. It's a meaningless prediction. Yeah, and so was this prediction. A miracle will happen is not an impressive prediction. If the prediction was the sun will dance, that would be a good bit more impressive. Or if the miracle had any sort of miraculous or religious element to it whatsoever, again, it would be more impressive. As it stands, there's nothing miraculous or religious about these sorts of astrological phenomenon or what happened on the day. If everyone watched the sun dance, and while they were observing it, everyone in the crowd heard the voice of Mary, again, that would be more impressive. But nothing like that happened. I will grant that it's impressive that a cool astrological event happened on that exact day. But that's about all it is. When we look at the actual data, what we have is a case of kids who are either playing pretend and it gets out of hand, or they're having an ecstatic dissociative experience and hallucinating. They then make an incredibly vague prediction that could have been fulfilled by just about anything. Then, on the day of the prediction, a perfectly natural and non-miraculous astrological phenomenon occurs, and the people interpreted it as being a fulfillment of the prediction. When you look at the actual data involved, it's not nearly as impressive as people make it out to be. Another great Marian apparition that was witnessed by thousands of people is the one at Zaytun, but I'll be evaluating that one in my next video where I respond directly to Capturing Christianity's Cameron Bertuzzi. For the sake of this video, Fatima is considered one of the greatest, if not the greatest, Marian apparition of all time. And yet, when you look at the evidence, it looks like a case of mass hysteria, leading to an incredibly strong predisposition, causing the power of suggestion and groupthink to leading thousands of people to thinking something miraculous had occurred, when in reality, there was an astrological event at a convenient time. No message involved, and nothing religious about it at all. So, now that we've looked at the actual evidence for one of the strongest Marian apparitions, let's look at the eyewitness evidence for the resurrection appearances and compare them to this. One thing to note, we're not looking at all the evidence for the resurrection. There's a lot more points to go into, which I've covered quite extensively in my podcast. For now, all we're doing is evaluating the people who said they saw Jesus, because Alex O'Connor made the claim that these reports are just as good as the ones for Marian apparitions. First, let's look at the case of the risen Jesus being seen by 500 people at the same time. O'Connor actually had quite a few good points to consider here, one of which is the idea that these 500 were predisposed to seeing something. William Lane Craig commented on O'Connor's argument regarding the predisposition of the 500 witnesses of Christ's resurrection.
Like Alex, I am skeptical of the Marian mass appearances. The person who experiences Marian visions are typically Roman Catholics predisposed toward belief. So for exactly the same reason, I wouldn't lay too much emphasis on the appearance to the 500 brethren. It's a piece in the puzzle. It's part of the cumulative case.
I kind of agree with him here, but this might be one of those very rare cases where I disagree with William Lane Craig. One thing to mention first, the predisposition to see something isn't really dependent upon the people being a part of the religion involved. For example, people showed up at Fatima expecting to see a miracle, so they are predisposed regardless of whether they themselves are actually Roman Catholics. But I do agree with Craig that the 500 witnesses of the resurrection also had a predisposition. The disciples, as well as the women, had already seen the resurrected Jesus and had probably told many of the other followers of Jesus. However, I don't think it's as big of an issue as he's allowing. One problem O'Connor points out is that we don't have much detail about the appearance to the 500.
So, what do we learn about this event from 1 Corinthians? Nothing. Nothing at all. We're not told who these people are, or why they were gathered, or when this occurred, or how Paul learned about it, or how he knows the number of people involved.
So we don't know exactly what the situation was like in order to comment on whether it could have been something like misapprehension of sensory data. Now that said, I think O'Connor, as usual, is a great deal more skeptical than reason justifies. O'Connor makes a point to challenge how well the 500 could have seen Jesus.
That's a pretty large group of people. How closely could they have examined him? How could they all have got a good view at one time? Imagine a celebrity like Justin Bieber being surrounded by 500 people in the street. How well would you be able to make him out? Could you even be certain that it was him?
I think this is true if it's an everyday kind of meeting, like he says, on the street. However, if I think about any time that I could say that hundreds of people saw me in one sitting, the only times I could really say this about would be my speaking engagements to a room full of people. It's possible that this situation was something like walking down the street or seeing Jesus off in the distance, but it's also equally possible, if not quite probable, that Jesus was speaking to the group of 500. After all, Jesus spoke to crowds quite often. Imagine for a moment a professor giving a lecture to a room full of people. Imagine afterwards someone says, as O'Connor does, "Did you really see your professor? How do you even know it was him?" Or imagine going to church and your pastor gets up and gives a sermon, and afterwards someone challenges you. "You expect me to believe that with these hundreds of people that they all got a good look at the pastor and know for sure that it was him?"
How well would you be able to make him out? Could you even be certain that it was him?
It sounds pretty silly to say that in this kind of a situation. Now, we don't know that this was a situation where Jesus was giving a sermon to the crowd. It could be this hyper-skeptical scenario that O'Connor is trying to paint for us. But if we look at the other examples of eyewitness accounts of Jesus' resurrection, they are far more explicit. They weren't far off in the distance, nor were they all during the night, nor were they only visual. We have cases of Jesus in the same room as them, having full conversations with his closest friends, sharing a meal with them, letting them touch him, and speaking to them on a hill, giving instructions, as he often did during his ministry. A Additionally, the early Christians really valued eyewitness testimony. There are many verses in the New Testament showing that this was a major focus for them. Even when choosing the disciple to replace Judas as part of the 12, one of the main qualifications they required was that the person be an eyewitness of Jesus' life from his baptism all through his ministry and even his resurrection. Considering the eyewitness testimonies we have are almost all quite explicit in sensory data, and considering the focus of the early Christians on the power of real eyewitness testimony, it would be incredibly odd if one of the main pieces of evidence was 500 people getting a glance at Jesus over a hill a distance away, or something equally vague. Again, it's possible the appearance to the 500 was vague, like seeing Jesus in the street, but I think it's far more reasonable to think this was a case of Jesus giving a sermon to the crowd. O'Connor also makes part of his case that Paul, who writes about the 500 witnesses, doesn't mention any of them by name. He also tries to make the case that Paul is very disconnected from this event, so where is he even getting his information from? However, Paul does comment that some of the 500 have died. If he didn't know any of the 500 personally, he wouldn't have been able to make this comment. So Paul knows at least some of the people in the crowd, which would explain where he's getting his information from. Another challenge O'Connor made was about a different situation where Jesus met with his disciples on a hill. This encounter is given in Matthew 28, and it says that some of those present doubted.
Matthew's gospel tells us that even when Jesus appeared right in front of his 11 disciples, some of them doubted. How could the disciples have seen him and then not believed?
This is actually a really interesting point. First of all, I would argue that the fact that the gospel writer includes this aspect shows that the goal is to tell the truth about the scenario. If he were making the whole thing up, he wouldn't invent a scenario where the followers of Jesus see him resurrected and yet some still doubt. Furthermore, if we follow the chronology of the gospels, weeks before the moment the disciples met Jesus on the hill and it says some doubted, Jesus had appeared to his disciples, but Thomas was missing. When the disciples tell Thomas, he doubts the resurrection, saying he needs to actually touch Jesus' wounds. Then later, Jesus appears to the disciples again, and this time, Thomas is present. Jesus calls Thomas out on his lack of faith and lets Thomas touch his wounds. Thomas's response is that he calls Jesus his Lord and his God. In other words, he doesn't doubt anymore. For my point here, notice, this event with Thomas doubting happened weeks before the moment that some doubted the resurrection in Matthew 28. In this moment with doubting Thomas, we can see that Thomas is the most doubtful of all the disciples, and that his doubt is gone once he meets the resurrected Jesus. In other words, none of the disciples have doubt anymore. So then, why does it say some of them doubted? At this point, it doesn't really make sense to say that any of the 11 doubted. Yet, Matthew 28 says some of the people present with Jesus doubted. How does this make any sense? Some have actually taken this to mean that other people within Jesus' larger group of followers were present as well. Matthew 28 does say that the 11 were there, but it doesn't necessarily limit the crowd to just the 11. Matthew 28 also says this event took place on a mountain, which for Israel is more like a large hill. And typically, Jesus gave his sermons to crowds on mountains, just like this one. I want to argue that this case in Matthew 28 of Jesus speaking to his disciples and some of them doubting is the same situation as Jesus appearing to the 500. I totally admit that this is speculative and we don't know for sure, but if we compile all the data and try to make a coherent situation out of it, it would seem likely that Jesus was giving a lesson to all his followers on this hill, and that there were roughly 500 people present. And it would then make more sense to say that the some doubted is applying to the 500 rather than to the 11. And while it is speculative, I mean, Alex O'Connor is going pretty hard on the speculative nature of his scenario as well. At least my situation has some reasoning behind why it might be the case, while he has no reason to think the 500 met Jesus in the middle of the street, like his Justin Bieber analogy. Related to this point, another argument O'Connor makes is to challenge whether all 500 of those present believed. And I think he's right to challenge that because I think Matthew 28 saying some doubted applies to that group. For the 500 asking why would some of them doubt, I think that's a bit easier to answer. They weren't with Jesus in a small room having a meal with him. They weren't able to touch Jesus and get up close to him. They weren't personal friends with him like the 11 disciples were. And now they're sitting in a group of 500 on a hill hearing a message. There's some room for doubt there. So yes, There was a predisposition among the 500 to see Jesus, and yes, their experience was quite likely not as explicit as other resurrection appearances. However, this doesn't negate the entire thing as being hallucinatory, as O'Connor suggests. For the Justin Bieber example, suppose you go to a concert to see Justin Bieber live. You have a predisposition to see Justin Bieber there, because that's part of your expectations and is in fact the entire reason you're even in that building. Does that predisposition to see Bieber then imply you didn't actually see him? Obviously not. In order for it to be a case of hallucinations, or even just misapprehension of sensory data, it would have to be a situation where the sensory data involved is vague. This is why O'Connor tries to paint such a skeptical scenario for us. I just don't think his scenario is what happened. And I think we have far more reason to think my scenario is more accurate. And my scenario actually makes sense of why some would doubt. So I agree with Craig that the 500 were predisposed, but I don't think that's necessarily as big of a problem as he appears to allow. All that said, we have other cases of resurrection appearances where there was no predisposition to see Jesus, and where the sensory data was far more explicit. Now, O'Connor's point was to say that Marian apparitions have just as much evidence as the resurrection. I think we still have good reason to think the 500 witnesses are good evidence, but it's just a piece of the puzzle.
It's a piece in the puzzle. It's part of the cumulative case.
But we can also go into much better eyewitness accounts of resurrection appearances.
I think the really important appearances are the appearances to Peter and to the 12.
First, Jesus appeared to 10 of the apostles at once, so quite a few in one sitting. In this case, they were all in a room together. He talked with them, even giving a lesson to teach them. He ate with them, showed them his wounds from being crucified, and allowed them to touch him. Next, a week later, Jesus appeared to Thomas and the other disciples. So again, a good-sized group. And again, we see Jesus having a conversation with them. He challenges Thomas, and he allows Thomas to touch his wounds from the crucifixion. Another one is when Jesus appeared to 7 of his disciples at the Sea of Galilee. Again, that's a good number of people all at once. Once again, he has a full conversation with them. This is where Jesus had that famous exchange with Peter, asking him if he loves him and telling Peter to go feed his sheep. And once again, Jesus ate with them. There are more cases than just these, but these are the strongest in terms of details and sensory data. It's also important to note that for the earlier resurrection appearances, before word got out about the resurrection, that there was no predisposition to be seeing the risen Jesus. We as 21st century Westerners are very familiar with the idea of Jesus resurrecting from the dead. However, for first century Jews, this was not at all on their radar.
One of the most remarkable things about the belief in the resurrection of Jesus is that these early appearances were completely contrary to Jewish beliefs, which predisposed them not to believe that Jesus was risen from the dead.
So these encounters were not vague, where Jesus is far away, or it's nighttime, or he's a blurry apparition or something. These encounters included sight, sound, and even touch. They spent considerable time with Jesus, having full conversations with him. They were even asking him questions, and he was challenging them, even making them feel uncomfortable with his challenges. There were a good number of people present, so it can't have been actual hallucinations. There were also multiple experiences like this for most of the disciples. So again, it's quite impressive that a good group of people like this had 3 different encounters where they all experienced the same thing at length with multiple senses involved. These were up close and personal encounters with quite a few people, but a small enough group that it could still be intimate and personal. Meanwhile, at Fatima, what do we have? We have a group of 3 children who were 10, 9, and 7 years old. They see an apparition, which no one else present sees. While they're seeing the apparition, the others present say the kids look like they're in some kind of a trance. It does involve sight and sound, not touch, and part of the sound aspect is the apparition giving a prophecy that didn't come true. For the miracle of the sun, we have just about the vaguest prediction you could ever make, saying that something would happen. What actually occurred was almost certainly just an astronomical event, like a sundog or a parhelic circle. There was no sound involved, only sight. It only lasted a few minutes. The actual visual aspect wasn't even miraculous or religious in nature at all, and there was no message either. When we look at the actual data involved, there's really no comparison. Yes, each of these has a large group of people claiming to see something supernatural, but when you look at what they actually experienced, the data is incredibly different. Sight, sound, and touch versus just sight. Explicitly religiously oriented, with the dead raised, theological teaching and encouragement, versus absolutely no religious content at all. Multiple appearances over 40 days for extended periods of time versus about 10 minutes. a dozen adults going about an ordinary day versus 3 children having a trance. No predisposition involved. In fact, a predisposition to not have a resurrection versus a ton of predisposition involved and even an absolutely massive amount of mob mentality influencing them. Full conversations going back and forth with challenging instruction versus absolutely no message whatsoever. The one defies all naturalistic theories, and the other can easily be explained naturalistically. So when Alex asks,
does Wes Huff believe in this Catholic miracle? Do you? And if not, why not?
Because the resurrection appearances were not vague. Because when comparing the evidence for the resurrection to the evidence for Marian apparitions, the resurrection appearances are far superior. The resurrection appearances of Jesus Christ still stand as excellent evidence for his literal resurrection, and they are vastly superior to any and all evidence for Marian apparitions. The two are not comparable at all.